Ready?
Ready.
Hi, I'm Joel.
I'm Andrea.
Welcome to Life, right?
Every week we share stories about things that we all experience, but for whatever reason don't really talk about.
If this is your first time listening, welcome. If you're joining us again, welcome back. Last week, we talked to Andrea and Essex about their difference in beliefs in their relationship. And we got some really great feedback from a lot of different places. On our Facebook page, Adam said it was a brave episode. I think he was talking about you and Essex, Andrea. What do you think?
Well, I didn't think it was going to be brave, but it was a little bit scary when it was coming out. So I guess thanks, Adam, for saying I'm brave. I did learn some things, though. Yeah, so basically we've figured out our issues now after doing the episode. Yeah, so hearing myself talking about our differences in beliefs on the episode made me realize that I really was in those conversations trying to convince him to agree with me. But that's not actually what I want to be doing. So this, I think, is a great idea. I think all couples should record themselves having disagreements and then listen to them, because you can hear what you're actually saying, not what you think you're saying. So after that, I did some introspecting. I thought about what was going on, and me and Essex had 3 different conversations all in one evening, trying to figure out what we were actually talking about. And it finally came around when I told him that the only thing I'm really trying to convince him to do is respect what I believe. And he said that he doesn't think I respect what he believes. And I was like, oh, but I do. The only thing I don't respect is when a person thinks that their belief is the only way to see things. And that's what I felt like he was saying. And then once I was able to say that, and then he explained what he actually was trying to say, and we just cleared it all up. So it was great.
It sounds like you learned some great stuff, Andrea.
I really did. And I think we've learned some great stuff too, Joel.
Oh?
Well, yeah, sometimes in this podcast, we've had some really great conversations, but we haven't always been able to share them. So this week, let's go back to our episode on identity.
On this show, we want to share conversations of people's lived experiences in an informed and curious way. We have some great conversations coming up that we want to give a little bit more time. And as well, we had a conversation on our identity episode that we weren't able to use, but we want you to hear it, and I think this is the perfect opportunity to do that. Because of that, you're going to notice that this episode is shorter and does not have an artistic performance, but we know you're going to enjoy it anyways.
So this is Kathy. Kathy moved up to Canada from the States to attend school a few years back and wound up having to cut her studies short because of a conflict between her identity and the school she was attending. So she met up with me at my office to talk about it a little bit more.
I would say that at my core, I see the core of my identity to be founded in how I relate to God, to specifically the Christian faith's understandings of God, as I've been taught and grown up to believe. And so I see myself as primarily as a child of God, follower of God, and beloved of God. And I should say that I often struggle with that core identity because it's not something that I consistently believe, even though that is always the center of and the source of the other layers of things that I wrestle with. It informs all the other identities that I may associate myself with. So yeah, at the core of my identity, and then, various other identities. And these sorts of identities are things that I'm I'm only now really trying to sort out in a more conscious way of the fact that I am a woman and a cisgender woman, and the fact that I have an Asian heritage and background, specifically that my parents are immigrants from South Korea, and that has shaped me in very specific ways, and that I'm this is just kind of one of those things where I've learned to be self-deprecating about it, but I am American and I'm from California, so those are also things that identify me. Though I should say I feel more and more Canadian since I've been here for something like 8 years. The thing that I would say is most contentious these days is that, and this is a form of identity that I often have trouble articulating because everyone has their various ideas, but as I've described it lately is to first say that I'm not straight, I'm not heterosexual. In the most simplistic settings where I don't want to explain myself, I will say that I'm gay. However, I recognize that that is inaccurate, and that I'm still trying to understand the complexity of my experiences of my sexuality, my attractions, or lack thereof them in certain settings, and how I experience attraction, how I experience relationship and intimacy, and all those questions that are associated with one's sexuality. So those are all things that I'm trying to figure out. I imagine it's a lifelong thing, but it's a very particular time, I think, of trying to understand how those things ought to shape me and inform me and how I live in this world. So I went to Regent College, which is an international Christian graduate school located in Vancouver, BC, and it identifies as evangelical in particular, and I did my Master of Divinity there several years ago now, and it was a fantastic experience. Learned a lot, and overall just very positive. And I also, coming out of that, wanted to pursue explicit Christian ministry, and I think at that time I associated it with being a pastor in a church, even though I recognized that was not the only or even the dominant way in which one could be involved in explicit Christian ministry. So that was a direction that I had hoped to go, and then realized that around the same time that I was wanting to go that direction, that I needed to be more open with my sexuality and not repress and kind of hide anymore, because I was having fairly significant negative impacts on just my well-being. In that, recognize that if I wanted to be transparent to some degree, that I was then not going to be able to apply for certain jobs at that time, that also, if I wanted to pursue ordained ministry, that would severely limit the denominations that would even consider me, regardless of the gifts and talents that had already previously and at that time been encouraged and pointed out in me. So those sorts of things no longer mattered so much as my sexuality, which to me, and at that time and still is something not unimportant or insignificant, but definitely not the core of who I am or even the most important thing to me by any means. So it was a strange time to suddenly realize that the community, which was my faith community that I valued the most, didn't value the most important, or my understanding of the most important aspect of my identity, which I talked about earlier, my core identity, but was putting at the forefront my sexuality and my sexual identity. So I'm getting this message of this is the thing that makes or breaks it for us, is your sexual identity. And then likewise hearing these messages of your sexual identity should not be your core identity, so you should give it up, kind of a thing. You should give up your sexual identity in order to be a part of our community more correctly. And so it was just a very strange time to try and understand how to position myself and participate in the life of Christianity or Christian communities. It was just a very confusing time. I didn't know where I fit in. I didn't know how to fit in. I didn't know how to participate or whether I could, or all these things of trying to figure out what my place is in the body. What member am I? What part am I? Understanding our various identities as things that separate us, that make us other than other individuals, that's a really important thing for us to, yes, generally, but all the more so as Christians. That's my understanding, is that we need to understand ourselves and our relatedness to those who are unlike ourselves. And in order to recognize and value those who are unlike ourselves, we have to understand the identities that we hold and the identities that other people hold, and actually respect those differences. An easy example would be, I don't think I will ever stop being Korean. I can say that that because I've been raised in predominantly white American environments, that there is a sense in which that culture has shaped who I am and how I am. So I can say I am Korean, but I am Korean American. And in doing that, I'm saying that I am slightly different than someone who is born and raised in Korea, and their identification with being Korean is actually quite different than my own. Mm-hmm. Because my experience is actually of being raised by Koreans in America. And so it's not the same as being raised by Korean parents in Korea. Mm-hmm. So there might be actually a lot of similarities between me and, say, my friends who are also Korean American or even Asian American. But those similarities that we share actually might not necessarily translate as similarities with a Korean person who was born and raised in Korea. Just because I have Korean parents. It's actually an expression of how my parents responded to being in America in a particular way and then raised their children as Koreans. So, that makes it kind of fluid, I guess, but that doesn't make me not Korean. I'm still recognizing, there is even a fluidity in how I understand that I am Korean. Mm-hmm. So I guess in some ways, and then once it comes to things like sex and gender, my goodness, I don't even know that I would be really hesitant to talk about it because there's so many ideas out there from the scientific world to the psychology world and beyond that I'm not well versed enough in. But at least I think it's helpful to have a starting place, or at least a reference point to understand oneself. Then you can move from there and understand how maybe you differ from or understand the particularity of that marker. So being Korean, and then also, how do you specifically experience being Korean, or being a woman? How do you specifically experience being a woman? Because otherwise, I think you get into those kinds of strange yet understandable stereotypes of all women are such and such, and all men are such and such. And it's sort of like, well, no, not really. I think being a woman, somehow there's a marker there. There's this kind of very blurry thing that we interact with and say, okay, I'm a woman in this way. Mm-hmm. But to be a woman changes actually in some very particular way when I meet another woman and realize, she is different than I am. And then it's like, well, just over half of the world of 7 billion people are women. And so now you're going to try and create a definition about what it means to be a woman. Like, wow, it's going to be pretty darn blurry. I think, so I don't think I don't find it really helpful to kind of throw out identities wholesale, because then how do you speak about anything? But I do think it's helpful to kind of make those distinctions between like a marker and how we interact with that marker in ourselves. Mm-hmm. And actually that interaction part may change over time. To be a woman of 50 or to be a woman of 5 years old, Mm-hmm. You're still the same woman even, that's the crazy bit, but you're a woman in a very different way, maybe. Mm-hmm. So good to kind of recognize both the fluidity as well as a place to kind of mark where that fluidity is coming from. I, for whatever reasons, would rather be in a faith community that challenged me in and recognized in me the more fundamental ways in which I identify. So particularly in relation to God, that was more important to me than someone saying you can sleep with whoever you want. So acceptance, right? It is not of certain things is not necessarily the whole picture for sure. And obviously, ideally, we are in environments where we are known in the fullness as much as possible of who we are, and also accepted in the fullness. But that's a long journey. It takes a lot of effort to get to that place with people, and then all the more so in communities. And so, just kind of gotta stick it out with people. A lot of minority communities of people or demographics that there is an experience of bias of this kind of like subconscious and ingrained bias against oneself. I think a lot of LGBTQ people who are coming out, one of the things that we often have to work through is ingrained shame and self-hate, because our environments told us that explicitly or implicitly that this group of people who identify in this way, we don't approve of them and we don't like them. So then it's out here, and then we see it also pertaining to us. And it's a really, it's just a struggle to kind of remove that ingrained hatred of this thing that we now identify with being related to ourselves. The only way that I can find and uplift you, find a way to uplift you very specifically, is by recognizing the very specific ways that you are different than me. I think the way that I understand my belovedness and my various identities is to say that I actually have to come to understand the relationship and the dialogue between my various identifiers and my belovedness that are very unique. So to be a woman and to be beloved, that is somehow different than to be a man and to be beloved, and that together those things make to be beloved, that idea, more, and not or against even, and so to be someone with complex sexuality and to not be heterosexual and to be beloved, that is a very unique contribution to a Christian understanding of what it means to be beloved. And so because I'm actually really being intentional about recognizing the many things that make me other than another, that exercise is actually growing and making fuller and more complete this understanding of being the beloved and this theology of being the beloved. And so then when I interact with somebody who is unlike myself, say a First Nations person, what I want to know is how does their experience as a First Nations person and the other things that they may identify with, other ways in which they may identify, how do those things very particularly contribute to being the beloved?
So that's our show for this week. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you come again next Monday. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also get the show from our website, liferightpodcast.com, or you can check us out on Facebook, facebook.com/liferightpodcast. Life Right is Joel Grinke and Andrea Lowen. Our theme music is by Matt Grinke, and underscoring this week was by Peter Abando. Life Right is able to be presented without ads and for free thanks to a generous grant from the United Church of Canada. We're produced out of the offices of Lynn Valley United Church in North Vancouver, British Columbia. For more information about their various services and programs, please check out lynnvalleychurch.com. Join us next week for more stories about the things that we all experience but we very rarely talk about. Because, well, life, right?